By the summer of 1944, one fact was beyond dispute. The German Panzer was the finest tank in Western Europe. This was not propaganda. This was not a comfortable story the Wehrmacht told itself to feel better. The numbers supported it. The Tiger I weighed 57 tons and carried 100 millimeters of frontal armor. The Panther, which was supposed to be the medium tank, the workhorse, had sloped armor that deflected shells that would have killed anything the Allies fielded. In a straight fight, on open ground, at range, German armor destroyed American armor at ratios that American commanders did not enjoy writing in their after-action reports. The Sherman tank, which was what most American crews drove into France, was called the Ronson by the men who climbed into it every morning. The Ronson was a cigarette lighter brand. Their slogan was that it lights first time, every time. American tankers called their vehicle a Ronson because that is what it did when an 88mm round found it. It lit. The crews knew it. They climbed in anyway every morning, which is a different kind of courage from the kind that gets celebrated in speeches. So the math in June 1944 looked a specific way. Germany had better tanks, better guns, experienced crews who had been fighting since Poland, and they were defending. The Americans were attacking into France with equipment that their own tankers privately described as inadequate, with crews who had trained in the American desert and the English countryside and had never fought a real battle against men who had. Every military analyst who looked at those numbers drew the same conclusion: German armor would hold, and then the Americans drove into the hedgerows. What happened next is one of the strangest, most consistently documented, most completely ignored stories of the entire Western campaign. For 6 weeks, German panzer commanders filed reports from the Normandy Bocage that said essentially the same thing. Their superior tanks were being destroyed by infantry with handheld weapons. Their range advantage was gone. Their armor was meaningless. Their training was wrong. Everything they knew about armored warfare had stopped working, and the Americans had figured out why before the Germans did. This is that story. If you want to keep hearing the stories they left out of the textbooks, subscribe now and hit the bell. Every subscriber makes the next one possible. To understand what happened in the hedgerows, you first need to understand what a hedgerow actually is. Not a hedge, not a decorative boundary between English gardens. A Norman hedgerow, what the French called bocage, is a wall. It is an earthen embankment, sometimes 6 feet tall, sometimes 10, built up over centuries by farmers clearing their fields. On top of the embankment, trees and dense vegetation have grown for generations, their roots weaving through the earth until the whole structure is essentially a living fortification. The roots hold the banks so firmly that they will stop a tank that tries to drive through them. Or more precisely, they will stop the tank for a moment, tip it forward as it climbs, expose the thinner belly armor, and then allow it to crash down on the other side, blinded, disoriented, unable to see anything in any direction. Normandy is covered in these things, not sparsely, densely. The fields of the bocage are small by the standards of open farmland, typically an acre or two, and each one is bounded on all 4 sides by these embankments. The roads between them are sunken, carved below the level of the surrounding fields by centuries of use, turning them into narrow corridors with earthen walls on both sides, offering no room to maneuver, no room to turn a tank around, no possibility of bringing more than one vehicle forward at a time. A column of tanks in a sunken Norman road is not an armored force, it is a queue waiting. American planners had looked at maps of Normandy before D-Day. They had noted the hedgerows. They had not fully understood what they were looking at, and neither, for different reasons, had the Germans defending the ground. The Germans had occupied France for 4 years. They had driven through this terrain. They had set up command posts in these villages and lived in these farmhouses. But they had been sitting still. They had not tried to fight a mobile armored battle through the Bocage because there had been no reason to. When the Americans arrived in June 1944 and began pushing inland from the beaches, the Germans discovered something about the ground they had been standing on for years that they had never had a reason to notice. It was perfect for killing tanks. General Major Fritz Bayerlein commanded the Panzer Lehr division, arguably the best equipped armored division Germany sent to Normandy. Panzer Lehr had been assembled from demonstration and training units, the best crews, the best equipment, the men who were supposed to show other units how armored warfare was done. Bayerlein was not a man who made excuses. He had commanded armor in North Africa under Rommel. He had fought at Gazala and El Alamein. He understood tank warfare at a level that most generals on either side did not. When Panzer Lehr moved into the Bocage to fight the Americans, Bayerlein began writing reports that his superiors in Berlin found difficult to believe. He described attacking with Panthers through hedgerow country and losing vehicles not to other tanks, not to artillery, but to American infantrymen with bazookas waiting in the vegetation 15 meters away. He described his tank commanders unable to see anything beyond the next embankment. He described fields of fire measured in yards rather than kilometers, which meant the Tiger's 88mm gun, which could kill a Sherman at 2,000 meters, was firing at ranges where a bazooka could do the same job. He noted with the frustration of a man repeating himself that no amount of armor rating matters when the enemy is standing beside you before you know he is there. He described with the precision of a man who had thought about it carefully the specific way the Bocage inverted every advantage German armor possessed. The Tiger Wise armor was designed to defeat fire from the front. From the front, at combat ranges in open country, very little the Allies could kill it reliably, but the Bocage meant that combat was never at range, never frontal, never the scenario the Tiger was built for. It meant that American infantry could move through the dense vegetation, crawl along the base of the embankments, position themselves beside a road, and wait. When the Tiger came down the sunken lane, it would pass within arm's reach. Not 2,000 meters, 6 feet. At 6 feet, a bazooka round hits the side armor, which is thinner, or the tracks, which are vulnerable, or the engine compartment in the rear, which will kill the tank as certainly as an 88 kills a Sherman. At 6 feet, the most feared tank in Western Europe and the most feared weapon in American infantry are functionally equivalent. That is not a small problem. That is Doctrine collapsing in real time. Bayerlein's report said this clearly. His superiors in Berlin, looking at maps, looking at the theoretical superiority of their equipment, struggled to accept what he was telling them. He was not alone in telling them. Oberstleutnant Hans von Luck commanded the 125th Panzer Grenadier Regiment and wrote about the Bocage in his post-war memoir with the directness of a man who had nothing left to protect. He described how his units would secure a field, occupy the embankment, feel reasonably confident in their position, and then discover that American infantry had moved through the vegetation on the adjacent embankments and were now firing down into the position from 3 sides simultaneously. The defenders had a field, the attackers had the walls around it. In Bocage fighting, holding the field meant nothing if you did not hold every embankment around it, and holding every embankment of every field across the breadth of Normandy was beyond what any defending force could do. He described the psychological effect on his soldiers, veterans of the Eastern Front who were accustomed to seeing the enemy coming across open steppe, accustomed to using distance and firepower to manage the threat before it arrived. In the Bocage, you often heard the Americans before you saw them. Sometimes you did not hear them at all. He used a phrase that appears in multiple German accounts from this period. Sie kamen aus dem Boden. They came out of the ground. What the German commanders were experiencing and reporting and finding impossible to fully explain to people who had not been there was an environment that had stripped their tactical doctrine down to nothing. German armored doctrine was built on combined arms coordination, tanks and infantry working together, using speed and firepower to overwhelm defensive positions before they could consolidate. In the Bocage, speed was gone. The sunken roads allowed movement only in single file, and a single vehicle destroyed at the front of a column could stop everything behind it for hours. The dense vegetation separated tanks from their infantry support within minutes of any advance, and infantry separated from their tanks in the Bocage was infantry that could be isolated and destroyed by Americans waiting in the next field. Hauptmann Helmut Rittgen, a tank officer in Panzer Lehr who survived the war and later wrote one of the most technically precise accounts of German armor in Normandy, described the sensation of commanding a Panther in the Bocage as fighting blind. He could hear firing from 3 directions. He could not see the source of any of it. His radio was full of reports from tank commanders describing situations they could not locate on their maps because the maps showed fields that all looked identical from inside a tank turret surrounded by 8-foot earthen walls. He made decisions based on incomplete information every hour of every day, and the decisions that turned out wrong cost him vehicles and men he could not replace. The reports from Panzer commanders in June and July 1944 have a quality that the official histories of the campaign take too long to acknowledge. These were professional soldiers, experienced men, describing a situation where their professional knowledge had become almost useless. They kept reporting the same problem because it was the same problem field after field, day after day, and nothing they tried resolved it. Now the Americans had problems too. This needs to be said plainly. The Bocage was not only a German nightmare. American infantrymen moving through the hedgerows were being killed at a rate that alarmed their commanders. The problem looked different from the American side. To move from one field to the next, you had to cross the embankment. To cross the embankment, you had to climb it or find a gap. Every gap was covered. Every embankment crossing was a killing ground. Men who reached the top of an embankment were silhouetted against the sky for the seconds it took to scramble over. In those seconds, German machine guns had clear shots. American infantry casualties in the first weeks after D-Day were running at levels that suggested Normandy could become a prolonged attritional stalemate, the nightmare scenario that every Allied planner had feared since they started planning the invasion. Units that had landed on the beaches in good shape were being ground down field by field. Replacement soldiers were arriving at the front, being put into line and becoming casualties before their officers learned their names. General Omar Bradley, commanding the First Army, understood the problem. He understood it because his commanders kept telling him about it and because the casualty figures made it impossible to miss. The question was what to do about it. The answer, when it came, did not come from a general. Sergeant Curtis Culin was a 29-year-old from Chicago. He was not a military theorist. He was not a tank commander with decades of armored experience. He had worked in a restaurant before the war. He was a sergeant with the 102nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron who had been sitting in the Bocage for weeks, watching the same problem repeat itself and thinking about it the way a man with a practical mind thinks about problems that need solving rather than problems that need explaining. If the tank cannot break through the embankment without tipping forward and exposing its belly, what do you put on the front of the tank that allows it to cut through instead of climbing? The answer Culin arrived at was scrap metal from German beach obstacles. The Germans had placed steel obstacles on the beaches of Normandy to impede Allied landing craft. These were welded steel constructions left on the beaches in quantity after D-Day when they had failed to stop anything. Culin proposed welding 4 curved steel blades to the front hull of a Sherman tank below the gun. The blades would dig into the base of an embankment and cut through the root mass rather than climbing over it. The tank would punch through the embankment at ground level, keeping its gun horizontal, maintaining visibility, arriving in the next field without having exposed its belly. The driver could see, the gunner could fire. The tank that had been a liability in the sunken roads became a weapon that could go anywhere. Bradley saw a demonstration in late July. The Sherman hit the embankment, the blades cut through, the tank came through level and ready. Bradley ordered the device built in quantity immediately, using all the German beach obstacle steel available, which turned out to be enough. He called it the Rhinoceros, or simply the Rhino. By the time Operation Cobra launched on July 25, 1944, approximately 3 out of every 5 Sherman tanks in the First Army had been fitted with one. This is the part that the German commanders' reports had not anticipated. They had been filing accurate descriptions of a tactical problem. They had been correct about what was happening and why. What they did not know, sitting in their command posts in the Norman villages, was that the Americans were in the process of solving it with scrap metal and a sergeant who used to work in a kitchen. We dig these stories out of archives that most people never look at. If you think this kind of research matters, the like button is right there. It takes a second. It tells the algorithm to keep showing people stories that aren't being told anywhere else. Operation Cobra began on July 25th with a bombing campaign designed to tear a hole in the German line west of St. Lo. The bombing was not precise. Some of it landed on American troops, killing General Leslie McNair, the highest-ranking American officer killed in the European theater, and the immediate aftermath was chaotic enough that some commanders on the ground thought the operation had failed before it started. But the bombing did tear a gap in the German defensive line, and through that gap, Bradley sent 7 Corps under General J. Lawton Collins, a commander who understood momentum and was determined not to lose it. Collins pushed fast, faster than the Bocage terrain had seemed to allow. The Rhino-equipped Shermans did not solve every problem, but they solved the specific problem that had been stopping the advance field by field for 6 weeks. Instead of searching for gaps in embankments, instead of funneling everything down the sunken roads and getting stopped by the first destroyed vehicle, the American armor could now create its own gaps. It could pick a section of embankment, drive through, and be in the next field before the German defenders on the adjacent embankments had time to respond, let alone reposition. The infantry followed immediately through the breach, keeping up with the tanks instead of losing them in the vegetation. Combined arms coordination, which the Bocage had made impossible, suddenly worked again. The German defenders had spent 6 weeks adapting to the static pattern of American attacks. Their positions were optimized for the fight they had been having. They were not set up to handle tanks appearing through the solid walls of vegetation at unexpected points simultaneously across a wide front. When the breach points multiplied faster than reserves could be shifted to cover them, the entire defensive scheme came apart. The speed of the collapse surprised even the Americans. Bayerlein's Panzer Lehr, holding a section of the line near the bombing corridor, was caught in the initial bombardment and the subsequent armored advance simultaneously. In his post-war account, Bayerlein described trying to organize a coherent defense on July 25th and 26th and finding that his communications were destroyed. His units were fragmented, and the pace of the American advance did not give him time to re-establish a line before it was already flanked. He had perhaps 70 tanks operational at the start of Operation Cobra. By the end of July 26th, Panzer Lehr as a fighting division had effectively ceased to exist. A division that had been the best equipped in Normandy was gone in 48 hours once the tactical problem it had been exploiting was taken away from it. By August 1st, Patton's Third Army was activated and moving. By August 15th, the German 7th Army was encircled at Falaise in a pocket that became one of the most catastrophic German defeats of the entire war. By August 25th, Paris was liberated. The 6-week stalemate in the Bocage became a pursuit across France that moved faster than the Allied supply lines could support, which itself became the next problem, but it was a problem of success rather than failure, and that distinction matters. General-Lieutenant Heinz Eberbach, who took command of Panzergruppe West in the middle of the Cobra breakout, wrote later that the transition from Bocage fighting to the open country pursuit felt like two entirely different wars. In the Bocage, the Americans were slow and could be held at enormous cost. After Cobra, the German army could not organize a defense faster than the Americans could advance through it. The territory that had taken 6 weeks to gain and hold was abandoned in days. He was describing, without quite framing it this way, what happens when one side solves a tactical problem that the other side had been relying on remaining unsolved indefinitely. The broader consequence, the one that gets mentioned in overview histories and then passed over, is that the 6-week delay in the Bocage had real costs running in both directions. For the Allies, those weeks meant men dying in fields that might have been cleared faster with better preparation. American divisions that landed on D-Day in good shape were shadows of themselves by late July. Whole battalions had been replaced more than once in the casualty accounting. The supply schedules, the planning timelines, the assumptions about how the campaign would develop, all of them were disrupted by a terrain feature that was visible on every pre-war map of Normandy. For Germany, the 6 weeks were borrowed time with nowhere to spend it. Every week the German army held in Normandy was a week in which reserves that did not exist were not arriving, in which the Eastern Front continued consuming divisions at a rate no industrial economy could sustain indefinitely, in which the strategic position that would have made a German recovery possible was not materializing because it was never going to materialize. The Bocage bought Germany time that the strategic situation could not convert into anything useful. The reports that Panzer commanders filed from the hedgerows, the consistent, accurate, professionally written assessments of a tactical situation that had confounded their doctrine, were read in Berlin by men making other calculations entirely. The reports described a real problem with real precision. The men reading them were trying to address a different problem, which was that Germany in the summer of 1944 was losing on 3 fronts simultaneously, and no amount of tactical excellence in the Norman fields was going to close that gap. What the Hedgerow reports represent, assembled together and read across 6 weeks, is a portrait of professional soldiers doing their jobs correctly in a situation their jobs were not sufficient to address. The tank commanders identified the problem. They communicated it accurately. They adapted as much as the terrain and their diminishing resources allowed. They were right about what was happening. They were fighting a war that was already lost for reasons that had nothing to do with hedgerows, reasons that were being decided in factories in Detroit and on airfields in England and on the Eastern Front in numbers that dwarfed anything happening in the Bocage. Sergeant Culin was awarded the Legion of Merit for the Rhino device. He returned to the United States after the war, worked in the insurance business, and died in 1963 at the age of 47, which is too young and largely unknown outside of military history circles, which is too obscure for a man whose invention helped break the stalemate in Normandy. His device is displayed at the Patton Museum of Cavalry and Armor. It is made from German beach obstacles. The Germans built the material for their own undoing and left it on the beaches when they failed to stop the landing. The German Panzer commanders who filed those reports, the men who described with precision the way the terrain had inverted every advantage their equipment was supposed to provide, are largely remembered in the technical literature of armored warfare and largely unknown everywhere else. Bayerlein survived the war and wrote about it with characteristic honesty. Von Luck survived and wrote about it. Ritgen wrote about it. The reports themselves are in archives in Germany and in captured document collections in the United States, available to anyone who goes looking. Read by relatively few people who are not military historians. They all said the same thing. In hedgerow country, a bazooka team in the right position beats a Tiger. A Sherman that can punch through walls beats a Panther that has to use the road. The advantage does not always belong to the army with better equipment. Sometimes it belongs to the army that solves the problem faster with whatever materials are at hand, including the enemy's discarded steel. The Americans solved it in 6 weeks with scrap metal and a sergeant from Chicago who used to work in a restaurant. The German commanders had filed accurate reports for 6 weeks describing exactly why solving it mattered. Their superiors had read the reports. They had noted the problem. They had no Rhino. History did not record the names of the men who correctly identified the hedgerow problem on the German side. Their names are in the archives. Their reports are accurate. Their assessments were right. History recorded the names of the men who figured out how to stop having the problem, and the one sergeant who figured out the fix with a welding torch and a pile of enemy beach obstacles. That is how wars actually end. Not with the better equipment, with the faster thinking. These stories survive because people decide they matter enough to pass on. If you made it to the end of this one, subscribe, drop your country in the comments below. If someone in your family was in the Bocage in the summer of 1944, on either side of those hedgerows, tell us. The grandsons and granddaughters of men who fought in those fields are watching this. We know because they tell us in the comments every time. These stories connect across the decades in ways that official histories never quite manage. We read everything. We'll be back with another story that the textbooks filed and forgot.